Welcome back to Web 110, HTML, and CSS. So in this video, I'm going to be talking about the CSS box model and working with width and height in a couple of various ways. The content for this video is going to correlate with chapter 6, and I'm going to have a couple other videos that are going to also tie into chapter 6. There's going to be one that is going to be looking at some CSS3 styles that are specific to CSS3. I'm going to also go over some content that is from chapter 7 that's going to tie into your midterm project, and that's going to be working with the navigation as an unordered list. And then I'm going to have some videos that are going to tie into some resources that will hopefully help with your midterm project as you are working on that. But this first one is going to be looking at working with the CSS box model, and then also working with width and height, which is going to give you the opportunity to actually start working with some white space. Because up until now, you really haven't had much flexibility in how you can arrange things, and things are going to actually start looking a little bit more like an actual website page. So for this video, I've got a couple of resources that we're going to end up looking at, and on the screen you should see there's that Lipsum website that generates lorem ipsum for you, and then this is actually a link that I had a student mention, CodePen CSS box model example, and I thought that was pretty interesting. So first I want to talk about what exactly the CSS box model is, and it's a way of looking at your content. Trying to figure out which one of these. They all kind of look the same. I kind of like this picture. I think this is the same one from your book, basically, but it kind of helps get across the idea, but it all looks kind of samey, so just kind of bear with me. So the box model is thinking about how you can add spacing both around your content and between your content. So looking at this picture, imagine that blue box, the middle box, that would be your content. It could be an image, it could be a paragraph, it could be a div that has multiple things in it, and that would be your content. And that's where maybe one of these other pictures would be a little bit more clear. So you have that content that's in the center, and then you have padding. Padding is just adding a little bit of space around that content, and you'll see next that there is a border. So basically it's being able to add a border around your content and then determining, well, how far away is that border going to be? Is it going to be right up against the content, or is there going to be a little bit of space around it? Something that would make this look a little bit different too is if you have a background color behind your content, that background color is going to fill in that padding area. So if you had, let's say, an image, and then you had some sort of color that would show in between, and then you'd have the border would go all the way around it. And then the margin is how much space you have before the next item. So you could have multiple boxes of content, and you could determine, is it going to be really far away? And the reason why I wanted to pick this picture, even though it kind of doesn't do a whole lot to help visualize the information, is it helps to show that you can control the amounts on each side. So you can say, I want the padding on the top and the bottom to be 50 pixels. I want the padding on the left and right to be 20 pixels. They could be all different numbers on each side. They could all be the same. It would be up to you to determine what you would want that to actually look like. So I like that this image in particular gives you a little bit of variety in how you could kind of look at that and break it down by sides. And in a little bit, I'll have us actually take a look at how you can write all this out. And there's a couple other pictures. I don't know that any of these necessarily do a whole lot more to help illustrate this. This one's kind of showing a little bit, this is the measurement for the padding right, this is the measurement for the border right, this is the measurement for the margin right. So you can kind of get an idea of that. I just found this picture by doing a search. I like to compare the box model to hanging art on a wall because I think it's something that we can visualize a little bit more easily. So in this case, envision all of these photographs, that's our content. And so that's going to be in the center. And then these paper mats that are going around it, that is going to be our padding. And I don't know how familiar you are with hanging artwork, but when you are cutting mats, you can cut mats all sorts of sizes. Sometimes you'll cut the mat where it's a little bit bigger on the bottom than it is on the other sides. You could have the top and the bottom just different than the left and right sides, but that would basically be your padding. You can have it any color you want. That would be the background color showing through. And then just like a picture frame, you can have different kinds of borders. You could have, now these are all the same border, but you could have different types of decorative borders. You could change if you want it to be a real thin border or a real chunky border. You could change the color of the border. And so there's going to be different things we control with the border. We can control the style of it. We can control the color of it. We can control the width of it. So that's another thing that I think kind of helps correlate with that example. And then like you can see here where they're hanging on a wall, we can determine how much spaces they're going to be. Now this actually all looks pretty even. I maybe could have found a better picture, but let's say that we want these two look kind of paired with each other. So maybe we want them to be a little closer with their margin. And then maybe we would want to actually add a little bit more space on the right side. So that way it bumps out a little bit from everything else. We can use the margin to help control how close things are. If you think back to chapter 3's content, there's that idea of proximity. When things are close to each other, we assume that they are grouped to each other. If they have a little bit of distance, we assume that they don't have anything to do with each other. So right now this is all one solid grouping, but if we were to play around with how much space there is, we can start to create different relationships and make things seem like they're connected or disconnected from each other. All right, one last example. I thought this one was kind of interesting too because there's some items that are grouped together, and this one's actually kind of fun to analyze if we were to think about, okay, how could we recreate this if we were to code it? Because something like this is interesting. We've got 3 things that are sharing, there's padding behind it, they're sharing a border. So if we were to try to create this sort of container, what we would probably do is we would have 3 things, whatever it is. Let's say that it's paragraphs. We have 3 paragraphs, and we would put them inside of a div. The div would have padding. We could have some little padding that's basically between each of these paragraphs, and then we could say, okay, well, I want to have a border around the whole div, and we could add some padding there, and then we'd have margins around things. We could kind of see these as all being independent. This one would have a much larger padding around it. We've got all sorts of different types of borders. Let's see. It's kind of hard to tell. This one doesn't have any padding. That would be kind of a good example of where you just don't have any padding. This one also wouldn't have any padding. I'm trying to, I can't really tell since this is straight on. I think that's framed, but you also could just not have a border. You could just have a piece of paper just hung straight on the wall, and you could do that too. Some of these, they look like they're right up against each other. That's something else you could do. You could just not have any margin. So I really like to think about pictures hanging on a wall or some sort of arrangement like this because I think it helps us visualize it a little bit better. Now back to the website that a student had suggested. This is from CodePen, and CodePen has a lot of really great examples. We'll start looking at CodePen more towards the later part of the semester, but they really wanted to recommend this as an opportunity for being able to play around with the settings and see how things change. And they have things labeled here where they're showing the content is in the center, the padding, the border, the margin, and it's important to get familiar with these terms. And then there's also width and height. Those are pretty straightforward, but those are also going to be properties that we're going to look at in this video. So we can increase the height or the width of the item. And then they also have this option if we want to include the margin in the generated size. Now that's something that we're going to look at as well, is how those numbers fit in. But we have, like here we have box size, and we'll get to that later. For now, we don't really have to worry about that so much. But we've got padding, so we can increase the padding on just the top. We can increase the padding on the right side. We can increase the padding on the bottom. But again, one of the downsides to this is, like, this helps us get familiar with this content, but it's really still abstracting it, where we're not actually seeing anything inside of these boxes. So your mileage on how helpful this is might, you know, be different for each person. But it is pretty cool to be able to see how this all interacts. All right, so let's go ahead and open up Visual Studio Code and kind of just get started. And we're going to be using that Lorem Ipsum website to help generate some content, so that way we'll be able to actually see things a little bit more easily. Now it's a new week's worth of videos, so let me also make a folder called week 4, and I'll just be putting all of my examples in there. And this one, we're really just looking at spacing and everything, so I'm not going to worry about putting it into a subfolder. I'm just going to put it straight into week 4, and we'll just call this box model. And as always, if you want, you can kind of copy off of your template. Since this is the first one that we're going to do in this series of videos, I'm going to just go ahead and type everything out. And for me, it's 14th. So for the title, I'm going to put CSS box model. That's kind of our biggest concept. We are going to also talk about width and height, but we'll just kind of tie that into this. And I am going to have us do our styles in here. Just a reminder, you really want to try to do your styles as an external style sheet, but for the sake of having everything all together and trying to make the best use of screen space, I'm going to just continue to put my styles internally. Whoops. Okay, so then we have in our body, I'm going to just for now have us create, let's just do like a heading and a paragraph. So for our H1, I'll just say box model. And then with the paragraph, I'm going to grab some Lorem Ipsum. I'm just going to take this first paragraph. And there's enough things that I want to cover with our content, so I think I'm going to actually type up some notes as we go along just to kind of help, and then if you want to copy these down yourself, you can. I'm going to start first with width and height to make sure I don't forget it, and then we'll go back into our box model. These are really straightforward. So width and height, they can be written as pixels, ems, or percentages. And you can basically control the size of everything. Up until now, everything has really been just taking up the whole width of the screen. And so this is going to allow for us to actually start making columns and making smaller pieces. And then we can start controlling how far away those individual pieces are. Now there's also some really great, so this is the width and height property. I should specify that. So these would be the different values for that property. Now, in addition to just saying the width and the height, and with the width and height, we already looked at this a little bit, but you could think of it like we've got the image. So we could say the image width is 100%. And then, for example, we could say the height is auto, which is what that's saying is the image is going to take up 100% of the space that it's in. So if it's the only thing on a page, it would just take up 100% of that page. And then by saying I want the height to have auto, I'm saying I want the height to automatically scale so it keeps the aspect ratio of that original image. So it's not going to skew it, it's going to just kind of always fit that size. And that's actually a really great way of doing it. You could change the height so it's also 100%. It would fill up the container that it's in completely, but then depending on as you're resizing it, it could kind of change that aspect ratio and it might not necessarily fit. And then if you wanted to, you could do a fixed dimension. I want to put this here just because this would be a better way of handling things responsively, which is really our goal. But then there is also this concept of minimum width, maximum width, minimum height, and maximum height. And the idea with these properties is you are setting boundaries. I'll just put that, setting boundaries for how small or how large a width or height can become. That's kind of the Cliff Notes version of that. So you could say, for this image, let's do another image, I want the maximum height. Now this is better for you to put a pixel dimension so that way you can be very exact. So you can say, I want the maximum height for this image to be, let's say, 1,000 pixels. So it can't get any larger than that. If you are resizing the window and it gets to that point, it'll just stop at that size. It won't get any bigger than that. And then you could also do, I want the minimum height to be 100 pixels. So, you don't want things to get so small that you have a hard time seeing them. So this would be a way for you to control how small something could get. So you're going to use maximum and minimum. Now, usually it's with the width, because when you're working with websites, we're used to scrolling the website vertically and kind of looking at that space. So we're used to the height being fine, but it's usually more the width where we want to set a maximum width that something can be and a minimum width, because that's usually how we're resizing things, is with the width of the space. But that's going to help us control the sizes of our objects. Now, going back to the box model, and just to kind of help clarify, these are properties. So these are actual styles that you're adding. The box model is a concept. It's a set of properties that work together that create this idea of it being a box. And you start with your content, and then you go to the padding, and then the border, and then the margin. So it goes in that order from inside out: content, padding, border, margin. And I've heard other professors also use an example of like packing a box to try to get across that idea of it being a box model, where if you were packing a box, you would have the item that you're putting in the box. Let's say that you're ordering something online. You'd have the thing that you're ordering. The padding would be the shipping material, if it's paper or like the little peanuts or something. And then the border would be the actual box itself. And then the margin would be how much space is there between your box and, let's say it's on a truck and everything is just kind of stacked on top of each other. The reason I don't like this example is because chances are if it's next to other things, there's not really going to be a margin. Everything's going to just be crammed in close to each other. I do like that it's three-dimensional because it helps you think about the space a little bit differently. But I like the visual a little bit better of hanging artwork on a wall, even though it is a very flat sort of dimension. And also you have more of an ability to visualize the different styles in place. Though you could think about the styling of the packaging material and how the cardboard box would look and all of that. But just another way for you to think about it if it helps. I think the more the merrier. Okay, so when you are working with these, you can apply them to your item. So we could, again, just say like image or something, but padding and margins are actually going to work really similar. So I'm going to kind of write out information on the styles together. And as we saw in those illustrations, you can control the sides. And the way that the sides are controlled is top, right, bottom, left. You can think of it like a clock, where you go clockwise. So the value starts at the top. So a couple ways that you could write your styles is you could say, I want the margin to be, let's say, 10 pixels. And you can do pixels, you can do percentages. Now, when I have the midterm and the final, I'm going to say that I want these to be either small sizes or I want them to be responsive. Chances are, though, your border and your padding measurements are usually going to be small enough that you can write them in a pixel or an M, and it would make sense. Your margins are something that might be better for you to write as a percentage. I tend to be kind of flexible in the midterm description and the final description. I try to keep it similar to other professors who have kind of stricter guidelines, but even if it ends up being more than 50 pixels, I think it's fine. 50 pixels really isn't that much. And when you are working with content that's really close together, I think it makes sense to use fixed units. So that way you have a lot of control of how the content is working. So I don't necessarily think in this case it really is that bad to use something like pixels. But just so you know, I think margins is going to be the thing that you're more likely to also use percentages. Border, padding, those are going to be ones where I think it's going to make more sense to probably stick to working with pixels, or M's is also a good measurement because it still is responsive, but the measurements are a little bit smaller versus percentages. If you say that something's going to be 30%, that can change pretty widely depending on how you're viewing that. Anyway, so you can say, I want all of the margin to be set to 10 pixels, or you can say, I want the margin to be set to 10 pixels, and that's going to be, well, let me just write it out. 10 pixels, 20 pixels, 30 pixels, 40 pixels. So what this is saying is I want the top to be 10 pixels. I want the right, whoops, now I'm confusing myself. The right to be 20 pixels, the bottom to be 30 pixels, and then I want the left. So it's going in that order. So if you want each one to be different, you would write it out and you just put spaces. You don't put any commas or anything. And so that's going to be what that looks like. I'm going to actually return this so you don't think that you have to write it together. You can also do pairs. Like in the pictures, I mentioned that you could do like let's say the top and bottom are the same value. So you could say, I want the top and bottom to be 10 pixels and I want the right and left. And it's going to know that if you have two values, that it's basically top, bottom, and then right, left. And I've had a student tell me like the way that they remembered the order of this is they thought of trouble basically. Which so if stuff like that kind of helps you remember, you could think of it like that. So trouble. You can technically also do like top and bottom and then right and left separately. So you'd have 10 pixels and then you could do like 20, 30, and that should be top, bottom, right, left. But at that point, I think it would almost be easier to probably just write out all four values so that way you don't risk accidentally mixing it up or something. Now you can also write them out this way, like margin hyphen left. And you could write that. So what you could do is maybe most of your values are all the same. So you could write out a margin style. And then you could go and you could write one that is specifically for one of these other sides. And it's going to overwrite just where it's applying to the margin left. So that could be a way for you to handle it. So that you have a lot of combinations. And padding is going to be the exact same as margin. So I'm not going to necessarily bother writing it all out because it will be the same, but I just want you to be aware of that. Border is actually going to do the same thing too, but you're going to have more options with border as well, where with border, you're going to be able to specify, let me do this lowercase, border, you're going to be able to say, I want the width of the border to be however big, and then you would do the style, and then you would do the color. So this would be saying, I want the width of the border to be 1 pixel, I want the style to be solid, and then I want the color to be black. Or you could say, I want the border width to be 1 pixel, I want the border style to be solid, or I want the border color to be black. And then you could also say, I want the border width, and then you could say a direction like right to be 1 pixel. So you have a lot of control. And this is where, back with the content that tied into chapter 2, we had the horizontal rule that would create a line going across. I think you can actually do, you can still use that, but there might be some cases where you want to sort of split up content with just a line. What you might be interested in doing is just using the border. Let's say you want to do border bottom, and then you could say for the border bottom, and then you could say what you want the border bottom to do. You could say border bottom 1 pixel, solid. So only the bottom of the border. And when you're doing these styles, you're going to do them in the order of first the thing and then kind of more specifics about it. And that's something that a lot of times people get confused with, is the directions, let's say, is for your homework. It says, I want the left margin. And so people will start writing out left hyphen margin, but just try to think it's the thing first and then the direction, or it's the thing first and then the thing that you want to do about it. So, you know, you've got the border's what? The border's style, the border's width, the border's color. And let me actually open up your textbook real quick. All right, so I just pulled up the book so we can kind of scroll through it a little bit. They've got their own little picture kind of illustrating the box model. Whoops. Here they have some illustrations of it in action, and you'll be able to see here we've got like margin bottom, margin left, and it describes everything. We've got information about the padding. They've got some examples of illustrating that. And then here we've got the border bottom, left, right, top, width, style. And here you can actually see what the different options are. So you can do a value, but then there's also like thin, medium, thick. And then with the style, which is why I really wanted to open this, we have options like none, which is the default. And then we have inset, outset, double, groove, ridge, solid, dash, dotted. And they actually have an illustration showing that. So the default is just none. And then there's this inset, which might be a little bit hard for you to see on the screen, but it basically looks like it's kind of going in a little bit. Outset looks like it's kind of popping out towards you. So it's just creating this illusion. And then double's got kind of two really thin lines. Groove sort of looks like it's cutting a groove inside of it. I always think of printmaking, where it's like if you do any sort of wood block carving where you can kind of carve out a groove. Ridge is kind of more rounded, a little bit like a picture frame. Solid, dashed, and then dotted. And so with dashed and dotted, you would actually be able to see any sort of background color that you might have through the background. Or I should say through the border. So they have a few examples practicing those. So what we're going to do is go back to our example now that we've got some context for all of this. and be able to add some styles. So for the H1, I'm going to add in background color. And I'm just going to do a simple solid border, text line center, and then we'll do paragraph. CC66, and then border solid. So I'm going to save that, and then let me find our file, open it up. All right, so this is what it looks like right now. I'm going to zoom in so we can see it a little bit easier. But we'll be able to notice a few things about our browser defaults. So with our browser defaults, you can see we've got no padding on our text at all. And so it's right up against that border. That makes it really hard to read. Same thing like this box model, it's centered because of the text alignment, but otherwise it doesn't have any sort of padding. And then by default, the browser does have some margin space between. And an interesting thing about working with your margins is if you say that you want your margin on one side, let's say you have a margin for the bottom of the box, if you've got a margin on the top of this other one, those spaces actually overlap with each other. So it's whatever has kind of that largest dimension, that's going to be what matters more. So let's say if I've got 20 here and I've got 10 here, then it could potentially slip in closer to it than what you want. So you might have to be just mindful of how you actually add those together to each other. All right, so I'm actually going to have that take up right side of the screen. Now, there's one last thing that I want to do with this video before I start another one, and I'll just give you a little bit of a warning. What I'd really like to do with the next couple of videos is basically walk you through how you can create kind of a very simple website that you will be able to use to help you when you're working on your midterm. So I eventually want this to start looking a little bit more akin to what a website would look like, and maybe a little bit closer to what your homework assignments are starting to look like. But I also don't want to make it too complicated, so I want to split up the content. But I would really recommend that you either keep using the same file or maybe make different versions of the file, so you could use this and then save a copy and then build off of it. But I want to go back to working with the width and the height, so that way I can introduce another concept, and that's going to be working with a website as a single column layout. And that's going to be one of the requirements. Let me actually see if I can bring up the requirement. All right, so for your midterm project, you need to have, and I'll go over this in another video, but and if you have questions, you can go back and you can look at the midterm video, but you need to have your wireframe tags, header, nav, main, footer. Navigation as an unordered list. That's going to be something that we're going to cover in one of these next two videos. Now, liquid layout, this is where I really wanted to highlight this. So you need to have your content not be the full width of the screen, and it needs to be centered. So that's going to be the thing I'm going to talk about now. And then you also need to include a wrapper and margins, and that ties into that idea of having that centered space. And then you need to have your sizes in percentages, your text measurements should be in ems, small measurements for padding, borders, and margins. I already said that I'm flexible in this number of 10. You can go higher than that. 50 is fine. Even above 50 could be fine. It kind of depends on what it is. But for something like working with the whole column, that needs to be a percentage. But if you're working with small pieces, chances are those are going to all be fine to do in pixels. Or you could do it in like an em or something. And then the rest of this I think is going to be pretty straightforward, but I really wanted to highlight this part here. Not full width of screen, centered, and then include a wrapper margin. Now this idea of a wrapper, it's also a concept. It's like working with the CSS box model where it's a combination of different things. So when you're working with this idea of a wrapper, and you might hear it called outer wrapper, you might hear it called container. And it's just this idea of you are grouping content together and you're surrounding it, and then as a group you are doing something with it. So if it's, you can probably imagine that, you know, if you think of that word group, what sort of element do you think of? Hopefully you would think of the div. And so what you do is you create a div and then you put your content in it. And in this case, we're going to use the idea of having an outer wrapper. And so we're going to wrap the whole outside of our website. Let me see if I can go to assignment 6. So this is going to tie in with this idea. So we are used to having our header, our nav, and then our hero image, our main, and our footer. So what's going to happen is we're going to create a container in a div that's going to go around all of these things. It's still going to be inside of our body, so it needs to be inside of the body, but it's going to wrap around all these things. That's why it's called a wrapper. It's wrapping around. And then you could call it an outer wrapper because it's going to wrap around the whole outer content. And you'll see here that in creating this wrapper, it allows us to add in a margin on both sides. So that way, instead of having a website like, let's say our school website, it doesn't have this. It goes all the way across the whole width of the screen. We don't have any margins on the side. So if we wanted to have a website where we had some margin space, we need to group our content together and then we need to add that. And the book actually has some interesting examples. Let me see if I can find. So we don't do the homework examples that they have in the back of the book, but they've got a website that's kind of similar. Whoops. This one I think is kind of interesting. And some of the other classes do this example, but what they're doing here is they've got a wrapper, but the wrapper isn't wrapping around everything. It's only wrapping around the bottom part. So they have their navigation is at the top, and then they have this header with a hero image in it. And then they have a main and a footer. And you can see here, so they've got nav, header, and then wrapper. So their wrapper wouldn't be an outer wrapper. It would just be a wrapper. And it would be going all the way around the main and the footer. And then that's allowing them to group that content. So a wrapper doesn't have to be used the same way each time. And so I kind of think of this like sort of a T shape. But you could even do something different. You could have let's say it's the nav and the footer are outside of your wrapper, and then maybe it's your header and your main are inside of the wrapper. So just because your homework is going to do something a certain way, and because I'm going to show you a certain way, it doesn't mean that you have to do your wrapper this way for the midterm. For your midterm, you have to have 2 of these pieces at least inside of your wrapper. So you could have like this example where you've got the main and the footer. You could do the header and the main and leave the nav and the footer out. You could do everything together, but you just need to show to me that you know how a wrapper works. And the reason why you have to have at least 2 is if you only have, let's say, the main inside of the wrapper, then it's as if you might as well not have it at all, because in that case you could just add in margins directly to the main on either side. So it wouldn't be demonstrating to me that you understand what the purpose of the wrapper is. So that's the reason for that. All right, so in order to do this, we would choose whatever content we want to be inside of here. So I'm just going to make it similar to the homework, where you would have your nav, your header, I've got my headphone cable is creeping onto my keyboard. All right, and then you would create an ID in this case because you're only going to need one instance of it. And then you would call it whatever. So it could be called wrapper, it might be called container, it might be called outer wrapper. So it doesn't have to be called anything in particular, but if you're looking up examples online, these are probably going to be the terms that you're most likely going to see. And that's why I wanted to let you be aware of it, so that way you get kind of used to that habit. But I don't want you to think that it has to be called something, because you could find an example online that someone's using slightly different wording, and I don't want you to get confused about if it has to be that way or not. All right, and then what you would do is in your CSS, you would say the styles for your wrapper, you would say, I want the width to be, let's say it's 70%. So that's going to leave space on either side. And then to center it, the easiest thing to do is just to set the margin to auto. And that's going to automatically figure out how much space you should have on the left and the right in order for it to be balanced, rather than you having to figure out, because you technically could say, I want the margin left to be 15%, I want the margin right to be 15%, but there's always going to be a little bit of crossover from all of your padding and everything, where that wouldn't actually mathematically add up to 100%. So the easiest way to have it centered is going to be having margin set to auto. So I'm just going to do that real quick. So in here, we need to start making this into more of a website. So create a header, put this in here, and then I can create a nav. Now let's make this into something kind of similar to your midterm. So all right, so we've got navigation. We'll come back to this navigation in one of these other videos. Then we'll do our main. And in order to make this look a little bit more like a website, I'm going to copy this paragraph and just put a couple of them so we have a little more content to fill everything. And then we can put in a footer. Let me just do a paragraph real quick. Just so we have something so we can kind of see once we start adding more things to it. So we've got our header, our nav, our main, our footer. Same order is what your homework is going to look like. Again, you don't have to do the same order for your midterm. You can change things up a little bit. You can look at some of the examples in the book to see how they've kind of explained how you can do things. So between the body, because the body is everything that's visual, we're going to add in a div, and we're going to add an ID, and you could say outer wrapper, wrapper, container. I'm going to just do wrapper. And then you need to take this end div, and we need to make sure that it goes after the footer but before the body. And then to just make this easier to see, I'm going to indent everything. So that way it's easier to see that all of this stuff is inside of that wrapper. And then in order for this to actually work, now this goes back into your order of how to write your styles. The wrapper is containing all of these things. And so if I were to have a body style, I would have the body style go first, and we could actually add a body style. We could say background, color, I'll just do light blue. I don't know exactly what color light blue that's going to be. But basically now let's save that real quick for a second. All right, we're going to refresh this. So now we've got this blue. Let me shrink that back down. We've got this blue is behind everything. And so what we'd want to do is I'm going to put behind wrapper, or sorry, behind after body, we're going to put wrapper. And then this is where we can put that width is 70%. And then we could also say, I want the margin to be auto. And then as you see this, we have some control over it. Now this is also a good place for you to go and put in the maximum width. Oh. So you could say, I want the maximum size to be 1200 pixels. And then I could say the minimum is, I want it to be, let's say 300 pixels, kind of about a mobile size. So what's going to happen is this column that everything's in, it's not going to get any larger than 1200, and it's not going to get any smaller than 300. Now, the way that mine is resizing anyways, that might already be the case anyways. So what I could do to make it a little more obvious is maybe I want to change this closer to like 800 and 500. That's not necessarily good sizes to work with, but it'll be easier to illustrate. So here you can see I'm continually making this larger, but at a certain point it's not getting any bigger, just the margin is getting bigger, and then at a certain point it's going to stop shrinking and it'll just be the margin. So these aren't the best sizes. Something closer to 300 would be better because that's closer to the mobile size, because this is going to create this horizontal scroll at the bottom. We don't want that, but that's kind of helping make sure it doesn't get too narrow. And then this isn't the worst size. You could maybe stick to that. This one would probably be better at 300. All right, so this is working with the box model and working with width and height, in particular with the wrapper, which is just a div with an ID applied to it, and then you apply some styles to that ID to help control the width and the height and the margin. And again, if to center everything, you have auto. Now, I didn't really show you what would happen without that, so let me refresh real quick. So if you don't specify, it's just going to basically move everything to the left, and then you have all of your space to one side. So we want to change this so we have margin auto. And that's one of those things you're just going to have to remember, because when you see the directions, it's going to say center your column, and you're going to think, oh, I know centering. Centering is text alignment. That's not going to be the method you want to use for this. The method you want to use for this is going to be having that margin set to auto. And this doesn't have to be 70%. I think 70% just kind of looks like a good amount. But if you wanted to see, like, what does 50% look like, you could test that out. Now it's going to look a little different just based off of the fact that I have the maximum and the minimum width. So right now it doesn't look a whole lot different, but you could test out, like, what does this look like at 90, or what does it look like at 20? And I think the percentage looks like something like this, 98%, looks a lot better when you have more of a mobile size. versus when you have a desktop size. I think it looks better to have a smaller percentage. And eventually I'm going to cover how to do sets of styles. So you can say, this set of styles is for mobile, this set of styles is for tablet, this set of styles is for desktop, and that will let you control it. So then you can say, all right, when it's mobile, it's going to have 90%. When it's desktop, it's going to be 50%. So you have a little bit more control over all of that. All right, so I would say keep this up for the next video, or save it as another copy. And in the next video, I'm going to talk about some more styles. And I think your book even just calls that section more styles, but I would actually say that these are going to focus a lot on styles that are CSS3, that are styles that are specific to the newest version of CSS. So just so you have kind of a heads up on that and sort of what to expect. So if you've got any questions about the box model, about working with width and height, about working with a wrapper, any of this content, you can leave a comment in the discussion for this week, or you can send me an email.